Hey everyone, how are we doing so far? How's everybody? Everybody doing okay? Great. Okay. Good evening everyone, and we're ready. We're ready to go. Okay. It's looking good. I hope everybody is cool. Beautiful day today. Ready to dive into stories and the wonder of stories. Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too. So hopefully we'll be able to enjoy that together. Okay. Listen, if you have your notes, okay, again, nice colored notes and beautiful charts and all kinds of stuff that you can, you know, put it together. And you might, I don't know if you're keeping these in a binder or something like that, but they're really good notes and they're going to be easy to review somewhere down the road if you want to, have a refresher. And again, if you want to just remind people of this kind of study, I'm keeping it as earthy as possible and as you know as basic with all the important elements as much as possible, so people of all different academic levels, whatever, can sort of engage in the kind of study. I'm trying to keep this as much as possible, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're going to look at this. And tonight we're talking about the power of stories. We're talking about narratives in the Bible. But before I get into narratives of the Bible, you can see that I've given you a chart on the very first page of the notes. And one of the things that we talked about is how the Old Testament is separated in three different basic, sections. And, there's the Torah that we've talked about the last couple of weeks, was on the Torah, and it's the first 5 books of the Bible. And you've probably heard the terminology of Tanakh. We've used the terminology Tanakh, which means Torah, okay, Nevi'im, which means prophets, and Kethuvim, which means the writings. And you can see how we in the chart that you've got the Torah and the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, is what's considered the books of the law, and then the prophets, the Nevi'im, is the listing there. There's 3 sections under that called former prophets. Now, most of us in our English Bibles would never consider Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings as prophets, but they're considered former prophets. And the term prophet, or the idea of prophet, is first and foremost connected to covenant, not necessarily predictive components of being a prophet. And when we get into the prophets, we'll talk a little bit about that, because there's a huge misunderstanding of what the prophet's primary role was. So, you got former prophets, then you got the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then what's called the 12. Now, they're called major prophets not because they're super important. They're called major prophets because of the bulk of their writing. They wrote quite a bit. Isaiah, for instance, is 66 chapters. The book's divided in 2 very distinct sections, if you want to talk about it that way. So that's how the section of the prophets. Then the writings, which are called the Kethuvim, and again, these are kind of English titles, and many professors will say they're not really comfortable with these English titles, but we use them anyway. There's the poetry, okay, Psalms, Job, and Proverbs. Believe it or not, poetry under Job. But they're really part of the wisdom book collection. I personally would prefer wisdom books far more than poetry, because poetry doesn't attach typically a strong element of theology, but the wisdom books are powerful theologies about life and God and the relationship between the two. Okay, then there's called what's called the five little scrolls, the Megillot. Okay, that's what Megillot means in Hebrew, is five little scrolls. You got Ruth, Esther, Lamentations, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. Now, typically, Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes, when you teach the wisdom books, which I do from time to time at Heritage, that's included in the wisdom literature. They're wisdom books. So, there's some kind of different categorization for those books. Okay. And then there's what's called history. And again, that's really not a good title for those books. But that's kind of like the category you're talking about. Daniel, and surprisingly enough, Daniel, even with sections of apocalyptic, is a historical, because it talks about a certain time period and the predictive elements of that time period, etc., etc. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, if you remember in the Hebrew Bible, that's how the Hebrew Bible ends, is in the first and second Chronicles. Okay, so I've given you that because of the fact that we're talking about stories tonight, and stories are really important. And I've given you some stats on stories here, which we're talking about narratives, right? But it's the most dominant form of literature in the entire Bible. In fact, I'll be honest with you. When I first became a believer and I started looking into the Bible, I was surprised how many stories were in it. There were the typical stories that David and Goliath, and but I've always thought the Bible was like more do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. Be right, be righteous, and then interspersed would be these little stories that would kind of like be in between everything. But that was in no way, shape, or form, when I first started reading the Bible, that I couldn't believe just how much narrative, how much story was involved in the Bible. And as the stats say here, over 40% of the Old Testament is narrative, and the Old Testament is approximately 75% of our entire Bible. So there's a lot of narrative in the Old Testament. And I've given you a list of the Old Testament books that are primarily narrative. So we have to understand how, the writers of the Bible, structured and thought about, creating stories and the intent of the stories, and how they used the details of the story to teach something. It wasn't just to tell a story. It meant to, proclaim something, or admonish us of something, or remind us of something, or teach a theological principle. And we'll get to all of those in a minute. And of course, in the New Testament, we have narratives as well. The entire Gospels, all the Gospels, Book of Acts, Revelation, are narrative books. Okay, so. And the more that we know about narratives, the better. I read, and I can't remember, I think it was about 6 to 8 months ago, I read an article that stated about how Disney writes their stories. Disney, from what I remember from the article, stated very clearly that they had a formula that they expected every story to follow. And if you look at every Disney movie and the way that they construct their stories, there's always a tension point. There's always, something that happens. There's always a tension point. There's always, a resolution of that tension, all of that kind of stuff. And every Disney story, whether it's animated, live action, everything has to be filtered through this grid and meet all these expectations, because they know. And you know what the reality is, from the dawn of mankind, stories have played a prominent role in communicating truth. and or communicating emotion, or in communicating, a heritage or a history, all kinds of things. We are so engaged with stories. Like we love hearing a story. Even, I could, it's amazing to me that, I could be in a classroom and I'm lecturing for 3 hours, and I can see, there's always heavy stuff when you're teaching. There's always stuff that, you got to plow through because it's pretty academic, or, it's pretty detailed. And it's hard to do that and keep everybody's attention. But it's amazing how you can stop in the middle of a kind of academic section and just tell a little story, and everybody seems to perk up, or everybody seems to, get re-engaged. And it's a powerful tool. And it's really recognizing, when you need to drop those things in, that really, I think, helps you be a better teacher, in my mind anyway. And that's the power of stories, because we love being able to relate to something in a way that makes sense. The more that we understand stories, the better. So here are the purposes of narratives, is to cause the reader to share an experience. And think about it. I love this. I can't remember which professor it was when I was in seminary. He said, imagine God could have very easily given us a list of do nots and do's, right? And just left it at that. But it's amazing how much of the Bible is stories about people and a nation, and relationships and conflicts. And even though they might be set in a time period and a part of the world that we're unfamiliar with, often the elements of the human experience in the story draw us in enough that almost those things become somewhere in the background, because the human experience is really universal, and the human experience is really timeless, or can't be locked in a way that's just unique for a certain time. I can't figure out how I'm trying to say it, but we can take the human element out of the stories and allow it to resonate in one way or another, even though we may not have any or any ideas of how to relate to the cultural components of it. But the human anguish, or the human, emotion that can be derived out of the story, is something that we can relate to very easily. It's same with music. To me, stories are nothing more than music in spoken word. That might not resonate with you, but that's the way I see it, because stories have the same kind of power to engage people that music does, or evoke an emotion like music does. They're very relatable in that particular way. Okay, to cause the reader to be an active participant or a spectator. Some stories just draw us in, and you're part of the battle. You're part of the scenery. You're part of the crowd that's hearing, these things. I don't know about you, but, the Sermon on the Mount, in many ways, began with a narrative. It talks about Jesus going to the mount, sitting down, his disciples, sitting around him, and Jesus began to teach them. We might not think of that as narrative, because now it becomes in a teaching mode. But because it started out like a story, because it started out like a narrative, I am now sitting on the hill, listening to Jesus, and hearing what he says about, blessed are they, and suddenly you're brought into the story. Okay, I think that's a powerful tool that's used in the Bible, because it could have very easily started with, here's Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those, and it would have been powerful by itself, but it would have missed the engagement part of just finding yourself as part of the crowd listening to Jesus. I don't know if you've ever thought of it that way, but that's the power of story. That's the power of narrative, to bring that in. Okay? To teach a point or a lesson in a memorable or exciting way. Okay, David and Goliath. Just that whole imagery of David and Goliath. In many circles, you just say David and Goliath, and right away it's about the underdog, and the mean person, or you can use that kind of picture in so many different ways in life, and most of us get it when you do that, because if you know the story, you know the picture that it paints for people when you use that analogy of David and Goliath. Okay. um, the thing about biblical stories, though, is that they invariably deal with God, man, and the world, and the various relationships around them. Stories are fundamentally biblical stories are fundamentally theological. You cannot, just take that part out of biblical stories. They're there, and they're crafted. They're not history. One of the big, I don't know if it's a frustration, but you get it every so often. You get people go, oh, the timeline in the Bible is not wrong to what we know historically, or something, like that. That really wasn't the intent of many of the biblical authors. They're crafting the story to depict the theology, and they may use certain markers in history, or certain, events in history as now, is that fabricating the story, or is that, how we get accusations of, if it's incorrect historically, like to the minutest detail, it can't be theologically correct. But that's just going at it from the back end, right? It's the theological component of the story that is the important component of the story, not the timeline or anything like that. If you read the book of Isaiah, for instance, you've got middle chapters of the book of Isaiah that we know are the two chapters that come there's 4 chapters. The 2 chapters before are, from a time standpoint, actually happened after the 2 chapters that follow it. Okay, we know that for a fact. But if you understand the way the book of Isaiah is structured, it is intentionally teaching something that Isaiah needed to end, or needed to, put that block in such a way, and to end the story, the narrative, and then begin a new narrative with part of a story that was actually earlier than what he ended with. Okay, so you just have to see the theological importance first and foremost. That's the important thing to take. So we need to remember that God is the hero of every story. Whether he's mentioned explicitly, behind every story, there's something that we learn about God, the character and the nature of God, because he is the hero of every story, not the people in the story. We have to be very careful about, and we'll try to delineate that a little further for you, because that can be a tricky one. Sometimes the person in the story is an amazing model to emulate. So it's not so difficult to be able to say, yeah, if you live your life like him, you're going to have the kind of life that God, the obedience that God wants out of us. So there is that to take out. Now, what the notes say is that if you make the character the hero of the story, what you've done is moralize the story. Okay, and I've got a little chart there, in kind of like a triangle, 2 people, and I've got I've talked about the vertical dimension where we're theologizing, the horizontal dimension where we're moralizing, and God is the central figure, but every biblical story has these 2 elements: this vertical element and this horizontal element. And the horizontal element is the human component of the story. And it's almost like it's happening in two dimensions. Take the book of Job, for instance. We clearly see the two dimensions in the book of Job. The opening chapters start with in the heavens with God on the throne, and Satan comes in with the angels, and that whole dialogue that happens. And suddenly we are brought back to the earthly realm, and Job and the difficulties that he experiences, and his friends, and at the end, we get a picture of the heavenlies again, and God, speaking into Job's life, and all that kind of stuff. But that book clearly shows the two different dimensions that are going on in the narrative of all of that. Now, if you've studied, and we've talked about this before, but the vertical and horizontal elements are part of how the Ten Commandments are shaped. First four are vertical commandments of our relationship with God. The last six are the horizontal commandments, how we relate to one another. And that's the same as how Jesus treated when he was asked, what is the greatest law in Old Testament? And when he said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And I'll tell you right now, if you learn to read the Bible with that dual dimension, I believe it's going to really open up your eyes, or open up your heart to see in the Bible in more dynamic and dramatic ways. I think it's really powerful how this all comes together. So keep those things in mind, and it's really a good way to read the Bible, because you're going to see the human dimension. You're going to see the reality of the human dimension, but at the same time you're going to also realize that there's something that you need to learn about the character and nature of God in all of it. And here's the thing. Most non-biblical stories, let's talk about non-biblical stories, are really devoid of the vertical element. Almost everything, like movie-wise or whatever, really is all about the horizontal existence. Sure, we have some movies about God and all that kind of stuff, but the vast majority of what we see in terms of entertainment is really on just the horizontal level. Now, there's some, that talk about the mystical or the mysterious or the spiritual or God or all like that, but rarely do they ever kind of define it in any meaningful way. Take Star Wars, for instance. There's a a movie series that is very clearly the dark side and the light side type thing, but we never get any kind of explanation as to what actually the force is, like how does it get it? They've tried to kind of put some kind of meat behind it, but it's a very mysterious. And in fact, that's one of the things I notice about the whole Hollywood engine, is that when I was growing up, if you were going to do a sci-fi movie or some kind of mysterious thing, you had to explain the anomaly in some way that made sense. This creature came from this planet where they, this and that, But we have movies today that are produced, and there's some entity, there's some, mystery, there's some creature, there's some, spiritual kind of thing happening, and there's almost zero explanation as to where it came from. And I don't know, I've watched a few of these, and I'm kind of sitting there going, wow, there's actually no explanation of the vertical element at all. And we just got to kind of take it by faith, or believe it. And it becomes one of the central components of the entire story. And yet we have nothing to hang our heads, hang any kind of understanding of what actually is going on in the background. And I don't know, maybe that's a thing for me, and maybe that's a problem that I have, but that's just a part of you know, writing entertainment that has very little, to me, very little meat behind it. Okay, and I could name a number of movies that just had no explanation about what the phenomena was. And anyway, the Bible in many ways, is pointing to a vertical element that is explained in other parts of the Bible, and we'll get to kind of those kinds of things in a minute. And as I'm just saying, the biblical stories are really primarily focused on the vertical aspect. Okay, you've got to be able to say, this story is pointing me in a direction or pointing to something about God, and about the people that he's working with in the story. But the reality is, when we read the story, it's the horizontal element that we resonate with the most. It's where we connect. That's why God uses those stories, because they're what speak to us. Sometimes God can be so objective, or just an abstraction for us, and it's hard for us to relate. But with the human element of the story, that's where it speaks into our lives in really powerful ways. I put a passage in there from 1 Corinthians where the Apostle Paul writes this: "For even if you had 10,000 others to teach you about Christ, you only have one spiritual father. For I became your father in Christ Jesus when I preached the good news to you. So I urge you to imitate me." Now, I put that in there because Paul's one of the few people that openly tells people to imitate him. That the example that he sets in everything that we read about him, and there's a predominant part of the book of Acts where it's about the Apostle Paul and the life that he lived and the narratives of how he touched so many parts of the known world in that time, in opening churches and proclaiming the Gospels, and doing it from people in very prominent positions to just people in the synagogues to all kinds of different audiences. And he's talking about, he's living the horizontal element in true faithfulness of understanding what he knows about God. And he's one of the few people that can say imitate. Jesus was another one that talked about imitate me. Love one another as I have loved you. That's just another way of saying imitate me, and imitate what I have shown you about life. Okay. So the one thing is that it's tempting for us to moralize a story just because it's so easy for us to relate to that part of it. So it's very easy us to moralize a story, to say things like, I wish, we need to be like Daniel, more like Daniel. Okay, I'll probably use that example down the road. But obviously, to moralize a story is really problematic. Has the potential for a lot of things to go sideways. Many of you know I wrote a book on how our strengths can become our greatest weakness, and that's true. You can. In that book, I demonstrated how so many of the biblical characters, when they failed God or when they had a moment of weakness, it wasn't because of something they were weak in. It was in an area that they were really known for. They were it was one of the strengths. It was one of the things that allowed them to be used of God. It was one of the characteristics. We talk about Abraham, for instance, a man of great faith who God really pointed in one direction and said, I want you to go there. I want you to go to Canaan. And it was like, oh, Okay. In fact, I don't think you even said that. I said, I want you to head in this direction. Take up your family and just go. And that's an incredible leap of faith. But there were, a couple of times where he lied about who Sarah was and got in a lot of trouble. And those were weak moments. But here's this man of great faith, and yet demonstrated weakness in the very area of faith. So why? Did he suddenly not believe God? Did he suddenly, those kinds of things are really important. But it does show that we have moments of weakness. And yet, the character and nature of God in the midst of dealing with Abraham in those weak moments, and what it teaches us about God and his faithfulness in our weak moments are really powerful lessons. And if we had have just taken the story of Abraham, we would not have taken seriously those moments of weakness, because we would have just shrugged our shoulders and said, I'm just human. As opposed to saying, God, I'm sorry. I'm going to do better next time. I know that's not what you expect of me. I know that you have a plan and a purpose for my life. And I know that you're leading me to something greater, and that you've made a covenant with me and a promise. And I'm going to continue to faithfully work that out in my life, to the best of my ability. And that's sort of the relationship that happened between Abraham and God in those stories. So this is, this is why the moralization problem, can happen. And of course, without the vertical element, idolatry would flourish. If we just stayed horizontal, and if we just moralized everything, everything would become an idol. The things that, my success as in my work, success in school, or, my social status, my social structure, all of those kinds of things. I don't need to forgive because I'm who I am, and all those kinds, things that would just drive us from our human moralization standpoint just become idols. And that's a problem. And I would argue that hope eventually would fade. That we are flawed human beings, but under the grace of God, and with the grace of God, we are able to live lives of exceptional clarity and exceptional faith and exceptional blessing because of God being in our lives and us living faithfully to what God expects of us. What's interesting, though, is that Jesus almost always started with the horizontal element. He talked to people about the present realities and the present needs and the things that they were struggling with, that for that person, for that human being, they were, it consumed their lives. You look at the people who had leprosy, for instance, and, that was a death sentence, or a sentence of community separation for them. And Jesus came along and approached them at their greatest need and would touch them or would speak to them. That's dealing with them on the horizontal level, right? He didn't run away from them, okay? And he would move people to the vertical. That's the thing. He just never left people in the horizontal. Sure, we're gonna speak to your needs. We're gonna touch your heart at what consumes you the most, or what is your biggest anxiety, or all those kinds of things. But he would always move it to the vertical. He'd always move it to, go and sin no more, because this is what God expects of you. This is what God wants for your life. This is what God knows is going to make you a better life. Okay, come and follow me. Those kinds of things. right? They were all related to a life that was committed to God. So, moralizing a story, and that's the other thing about moralizing a story, it just leaves God totally out of the picture. Again, I'm going back to the story of Daniel. Daniel, in my mind, is, other than Jesus Christ, the only other perfect human being in the Bible. There's no flaws in that person, especially when you come to terms with the fact that he was taken into captivity because of no sin of his own, but of the sin of the nation, that they had failed horribly and were taken into captivity into Babylon. He, for all intensive purposes, was very successful, was young, was probably part of the upper class, was an up-and-coming potential, Jewish young man that had all kinds of promise as part of his life. He may have been well off. There's an implication in the text that he was likely well off. And yet, here he is taken into captivity, and instead of being bitter, or even at the very least, we would have expected him to say, okay, I'm stuck here. I'm going to have to live this out, but I'm not going to give these people, my best, or I'm not going to, I'm going to make it hard for them, or I'm not going to, be happy about it and be miserable. And you know what? In reality, many of us would have said, I don't blame you for feeling the way you did. You got carried off. Your name was changed. In fact, one of the strange things about Daniel is we have no lineage of Daniel. That tells you how much they cut off his entire life prior to being taken into captivity, because that's unusual in the Bible. Because in the Bible is usually Daniel, son of. We don't even get that. Daniel is literally, him and his three friends are cut off from the world that they knew. And yet Daniel goes into captivity and he excels there because he realizes he's not working for them. He's working for God. And he serves them so well, even though no one would have blamed him if he had served them otherwise. That he served them so well that, for years and years, he was in the court of the kings, serving them with full-heartedness, and them, seeing him as a trusted advisor and a trusted confidant. And that's really powerful when you think of it, okay? But at the same time, Daniel's entire life was the way it was because of his faithful obedience to God, to Yahweh. In fact, even when he prays, there's a number of prayers in Daniel where he prays, forgive the nation, Lord. We deserve what you gave us. Like that's, he says, we are in this mess, we are in this exile because we, stomped on your covenant, and you told us that we needed to be obedient, and we are being punished deservedly by you for what we have done. And again, if you read the book of Daniel carefully, you can emulate Daniel, but Daniel, in almost everything he does, points back to God. And he does that a number of times when he's talking to the kings. When he's, deciphering their dreams, he'll say, no, it's the God that I serve that gave me the answer. Daniel doesn't even take credit for the stuff. He honors God in everything. And that's a really important distinction to make when we read the book of Daniel, is to see Daniel's obedience to God and the vertical teachings that it gives us as lessons as we read that book. Okay. Now stories are recorded selectively to make a point, and that's part of why, I give you the kind of exegesis of Daniel, because it's very powerful how you get the vertical and the horizontal dimension working. And again, from a horizontal dimension, that's the thing that amazes me about Daniel. Daniel is for all intents and purposes an unusual human being, because he had every right, every reason, and people would have endorsed him if he had said, I'm just gonna do what I need to do. I'm just do the minimum and just get by. But he does. He refuses to do that. In fact, Daniel's a great example of the excellence that God expects for each and every one of his children, because that's God, and he's serving God. So he's not going to give God scraps, or give God nothing, or give God the bare minimum. That's not Daniel at all. So whoever taught him, parents, all covenant, all of that kind of stuff, taught him really well, and that's part of why he is so so well respected in the book. Structure of narrative. We talked earlier on about Disney has this structure that you have all these different points that the story has to kind of move through, and biblical stories are no different. Like, a lot of them have this kind of thing. There's the setting, there's the action begins, there's a conflict. Almost every story has conflict of one way or another, something that makes you go, how's this going to end up, or this is a problem, or this is a situation, or look at the horizon, look what's coming, what are we going to do about it, all those kinds of things. And that's the power of the story, right? Conflict intensifies, or there's complications, or there's just no way. The climax of the story happens. The worst that you could possibly imagine is happening. How are they going to get out of this? Well, what's going to happen? Who's going to save the day? All those kinds of things. None of you listening to this for a second, have not been able to seen a story that you don't relate to any of that kind of stuff, because you've witnessed it in so many different stories. Okay, and then the conflict begins to unravel. Something happens. Someone comes along and says, no, they never said that. No, they never did that. No, if you knew what really, no, he really loves you. all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, whatever was terrible or conflict, suddenly starts to resolve. And things, for whatever, normalize in one way or another. And there's a conclusion, there's a resolution, there's a part of the story that's the teaching component at the very end. I know I should never do that again. Those kinds of things. That's the wonderful. But that's the way that stories. And in fact, you could take narrative, University College, and not take, and not have it as a biblical narrative, and you're likely going to get the same chart, because that's the power of story. That's stories speak to the way that we love conflict and all that kind of stuff. All right, let me go quickly through the basic ingredients of a narrative. Physical settings. There's always different settings. Physical setting, temporal setting. What the time. Cultural settings. Whenever the Bible says something about the setting, the time of year, the season, who was ruling at the time, that's always a setup to the story. Okay, the setting obviously is a setup to the story. And then there's the characters, by direct description of the storyteller, or portrayed by other characters, response to them. All kinds of different parts of what makes a character. We interestingly enough, there are some characters that have long stories. David, for instance, is the longest. Is the person that we have, the longest kind of story line in the Bible about. Apart from Jesus and the four Gospels, we get a big chunk of David's life, from early on to the end of his life and everything that happens to him in between. So we have a long storyline. Now, the interesting thing is, why would we have a long storyline about David? Because David is in covenant with God. David ends up being part of the kingship lineage of Jesus Christ, part of the messianic expectation, and part of the formation of Israel in very critical and key times, and part of the promise for the temple coming later with his son Solomon. There's just so many threads that are theological in the life of David that it's just not about David killing Goliath. There's just so much more involved with his life. There's plots. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of this, but there's all different kinds of plots, because at the heart of the plot is some kind of conflict. You're going to find some kind of conflict, and that's what brings us into the story. That's what makes the story so compelling and so powerful. There are types of biblical narratives. Okay. I love these categories, because there's a heroic, type of narrative. Joseph's story is a heroic story. The Ruth story is a heroic story. The stories in Judges, there's a lot of heroes in there, at a time when Israel was really struggling. Great. Again, we mentioned David and Goliath. That's a heroic narrative about something happening that put David literally on the map. Okay. There's epic. The Exodus is an incredible epic story. The conquest of the Promised Land, the story of the four patriarchs. That's a huge arc in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch. That's a huge arc, but that arc is really important because of the promise of the covenant that's being passed down from person to person, and into the formation of the nation of Israel. Vitally important. It's part of the theology. And in fact, the whole Bible is this epic, tale of, between paradise and paradise. And that's what the Bible is. The Bible is bookends of paradise, from paradise to paradise. First two chapters of the Bible and the last two chapters of the Bible are all about paradise, and those are the only 4 chapters in the entire Bible where no conflict exists. Everything's perfect. Okay. No human conflict exists. So you got comedy. There's an old category of comedy, which is really social drama. When we think of comedy, we think we have to be laughing, but that's not necessarily Old English terminology for comedy. Comedy was really social drama. Anything that was dramatic in a social way was considered a comedy. Daniel in the Lion's Den, nobody's laughing about that one, but that's a social drama and under the category of comedy. David and Goliath, again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Those are, social drama stories, but, under the category of comedies. Many of you have heard of Greek comedies. Well, if you ever look at a lot of the Greek comedies, they're not necessarily funny, right? They're very soap opera-ish, and all the stuff going on. There's tragedy. You look at the life of Samson, the King Saul, Adam and Eve. Those are the types of biblical narratives that are in the Bible. Now, for many of you, this just may be unnecessary, because a story is a story, and there's ways of you don't always have to unpack a story based on criteria, because a story is so many different elements. But we do have some, I've got some 10 points here just to walk you through, And they're just things to think about. Hopefully from tonight, you're going to get some things that are going to resonate with you. Or maybe the next time you read a story, you're looking for the God element in the story, not just looking at the human kind of tension that exists, that there's something that's going to happen, that there's an expectation that God is going to show up in some way, and it's going to teach us about the character and nature of God in spite of the human element and the human problems that's happening. Okay? Number one, narratives don't always directly teach a doctrine. It's not like you're going to get to the end of a story and it's going to clearly say this doctrine was on the omnipotence of God, or the omniscience of his character and seeing the future. You're not going to normally get that out of the narratives. They usually illustrate a doctrine that is taught elsewhere in Scripture. Okay, very much we look at stories, and they just confirm, a doctrine that is taught clearly in other parts of Scripture. There's all kinds of examples in this, and frankly, I can't think of one right now. I don't know if it's been a long day and the heat's gotten to me, but there are many overlaps in Scripture. For instance, we know that God is holy. Okay, there are many times in the narratives of Israel going through the wilderness where they're reminded of the holiness of God. There are many times, with the pillar of fire, the tabernacle. All those stories relate back to understanding of holiness. In fact, when you look at the tabernacle and you go into the structure of the tabernacle and you go, well, why all the trouble of this? And you start talking about the sacrificial system. In the end, you kind of go, well, God is holy. There is this separation of the nation. That's why the nation is divided in the way it is. That's why there's only certain people that can touch, the curtains of the tabernacle. Only a certain, group of Israelites are allowed to put certain parts of the tabernacle together. That's their job, because God is holy. And that's an expression of his holiness. That there's, so that's part of what we're talking about, and it just reinforces this whole idea of some of the characteristics that we know about God that are expressed in these stories that we need to remind ourselves. What people are and do are not necessarily a good example to us. I get, this is a big struggle for me in conversations that I have with people who have just maybe a small understanding of the Bible, or they'll say, well, what about the person who did this? Like, why is it in the Bible? And it's like, oh, okay, well, are you thinking that that's an endorsement because of that activity? Well, yeah, well, why would it be in the Bible? I've had that kind of said. But, there's good characters, there's bad characters, there's, all kinds of characters. They're part of the story, but they're not necessarily, good examples for each and every one of us. Most of the characters are presented realistically as imperfect, even though there will be certain scenes when they represent commendable faith, values, and morals. When I became a believer early on, one of the things that really drove me into the Bible and into Christianity overall was just how real the people were. That I can't even begin to express to you how much that touched me, because the people, it wasn't like an over-glorification or everybody was perfect, because that would have just made the entire book seem hollow, rigged, even though all the stories in that are theologically, it's all theologically driven, it portrays the people in reality, and that just was unbelievable for me. when I started realizing it. It's what drove me to write the book that I did, because it was those weak moments. It was those moments where they had difficulties that really attracted me to these people who, in the end, were great, people of faith. It was just amazing. Okay, the lesson is often not explicitly stated. We are left to, our own understanding of, not our own understanding of right or wrong, but that's part of, working through the story to see what it is that God is trying to teach us. What is it that, these people are being an example of, or not to be an example of, okay? All narratives are selective. The events and the data are purposeful for the point of the story. Now, I said this earlier, okay? We talked about timelines and stuff like that, but the stories are selective, narrative. You get the people who say, oh, in the Gospels, there's a slight difference in, one story to the other story. Again, it's missing the point, and I know we're talking about Old Testament narrative, but that's the example that came to my mind. Whatever the purpose of the particular author is, they're sculpting the text and the story to convey a theological principle that they're trying to, allow us to see very, very clearly. Narratives have particular specific purposes. Often, not all biblical, issues are answered. Okay, there's going to be some mystery to, because that's what stories are. There are some. Not all biblical issues are answered. Teaching may be either explicit or implicit, and again, read the stories carefully so you can learn that, and remember that God is ultimately the hero. That's what we have to pull from every one of these narratives, is to realize when we talk, David and Goliath, what an example. Do you realize it's God that's the hero in that? And do you realize that David was a bit arrogant before, as he comes? His one brother, sees him and say, "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be tending the sheep." And there's a statement in Hebrew that, if you don't know Hebrew, and English, it's really hard to bring across, but it's hard to get the implication. In actual Hebrew, the brother is actually saying to David, I know that you have a tendency towards pride, and you're like a peacock right now, right? There's a little kind of burr in that particular story that most of us don't see easily in the English. The point of the matter is, God is using David, and it's not David's, powerful or anything. You got to remember, it's the hand of God that guided the slingshot. It's the hand of God that allowed David to be victorious over Goliath. But often we, make David the hero when really it's God. And that's the power of narratives. That's the power of stories. And that's the power of stories, the way it resonates with all of us. And we all know that stories is one of our favorite ways of touching people's hearts and lives. And the Bible's no different. God understands the power of stories. And in fact, stories have been used for centuries, since the dawn of creation, to convey stories of meaning, hope, history, legacy, all of those kinds of things. And the Bible's no different. We just have to be careful to understand what they're there for, what the parameters are, and who ultimately we are learning about. Well, God bless you. Thank you for being part of this. And again, let me remind you, if you get a chance to subscribe to it, hit that button and subscribe, like the podcast, like the channel or whatever. I would really appreciate it. Thank you, each and everyone, for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time and hanging out with me on a Monday night, on a beautiful, beautiful Monday night, when you probably could have been out on the porch having, a cool glass of water and listening to the birds, because I can hear the birds outside my window right here, getting excited about the day that lies ahead. So God bless you. I hope you were blessed tonight. I hope you learned something tonight. And I really appreciate you being part of the study. God bless you, and see